White balance, exposure, contrast, even creative color grading, this one panel does it all. This video is really aimed at new photographers and people just starting out on their photo editing journey. But if you're into more high-end photo editing, I'd still recommend checking out my channel and consider subscribing, because as a multi-award-winning professional photographer who's been in the game for well over a decade, I'm sharing all of my knowledge freely with you guys, so I'd love to have you along for the ride. But anyway, let's get into this one. So we're going to be looking at the light panel today, and if you don't know it, you really should. It's an absolute powerhouse of raw photo editing capability, and within that one panel is basically the same processing engine that drives Lightroom. So for a fraction of the cost, we've basically got the photo editing power of Lightroom plus all those other amazing AI tools and all the creative tools as well. Currently in my panel, I'm showing every option that we have available to us, but when you open the light panel for the first time, it may look like this and have the curves and blacks and whites just collapse down. And so when we get to those, all you need to do is just click that little triangle or the tab here, and that will expand those open for you. So the first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the profile section here. Now, every digital photo is made up of a collection of information that was captured by your camera's sensor. That information needs to be interpreted so that we can actually see the photo. And the thing that interprets that data is the profile. So if we click where it says Luminar Default, we'll see that we have a whole range of other options. Now, your options may look different to what I have access to. And that comes down to whether or not your camera manufacturer has actually supplied Skylum with access to that profile. But hopefully you'll have access to something that's specific to your camera. So that will say camera and then followed by another word. So we have here an option to apply a flat profile. And just like that, we've lost even more contrast, which you may think, oh, I don't really want to be doing that. Why would you apply that profile? Well, believe it or not, a flat profile actually has a really valid and usable place, and I use it all the time for my professional work. But in this case, we're dealing with quite a flat image already. So watch this. If I go to camera landscape, just like that, our image is given a lot more pop by introducing more contrast. And this is all coming down to how the data that exists in our photo file is being interpreted by the profile and then displayed on our screen. So if you can get a camera matching profile applied, you're going to find that your colors are much more accurate. You can get more or less contrast in your photo. And basically you're giving yourself an editing kickstart. Because I want to show you guys how these sliders affect the image, I actually want to be able to increase the contrast myself. So I'm going to go for a camera standard profile. And while that does look flat, if I quickly switch back to the Luminar Default, you'll see that even the camera standard profile is a big improvement over Luminar's default profile. Luminar's default profile is very generic and it's just covering its bases. So if you can, you want to go for something that's specific to your camera model. So camera standard, there we go. Next up, we've got what's known as white balance. It's super easy. Do we want the photo to be more blue, more orange, or just neutral? We also have the option to control the tint, and that's whether we want the photo to appear more magenta or more green. Pretty easy, but it's really important to get this right. Whether you try and get your white balance accurate to the scene, or warm things up, or cool it down, that's entirely up to you, but you want to get this right and set this with purpose. Currently, what's assigned to this photo is as shot. So that means whatever I had my camera set at when I took this photo, that is what we have applied here. But if we drop this box down, you'll see that we have access to change our white balance to match to daylight, to match to cloudy, change it to the shade, or even to tungsten. And you guys may have noticed as I was changing this white balance, the temperature and tint sliders were actually changing as I changed this. So if I go back to daylight, all of a sudden you see that the temperature jumps up to 5,500. So effectively what these options are doing is basically controlling the temperature and the tint. And this number that's written here, this isn't just an arbitrary number. That's actually 5,500 degrees Kelvin for you science nerds out there. But basically we don't need to worry about what that number is. We can either come in and choose one of these presets right here, or what we can do is actually control the temperature ourselves. So we can take our temperature down into the blues, or we can warm it up and take it towards the oranges. And really you just have two options when you're working with white balance. You either want to neutralize your white balance, and your other option is to take a more creative approach where you may decide, I want to warm my photo up, or I want to cool it down. So that's what the temperature slider does, and the tint pretty much does the same thing, except we're talking into the greens or the magentas. I'm going to double click that to reset the tint, and normally if I'm working with white balance, it's actually the temperature slider that gives you more bang for your buck. The tint, you rarely need to move that too far, but you may want to make subtle adjustments with that. If you're wondering what this little icon is right here, this tool actually allows you to control the white balance by saying to Luminar, wherever I click should be neutral grey. So you can see here it says pick a neutral target, and we're seeing a magnification square here. So we could find something that we know should be a neutral colour. So the white van here, we could just click on that. And just like that, Luminar's made some slight adjustments so that this vehicle doesn't actually have any colour cast in it. We're saying that this can be our grey point, and then the temperature and the tint adjust accordingly. Exposure is right at the very core of photography itself, but it's super simple. Is your photo bright or is your photo dark? That's it. I was at a party the other night and I bumped into a good friend of mine who is a Luminar user, but by his own confession, he's very much a novice photographer. And there are a lot of photography terms that I assume everybody knows, but if you're just at the beginning of your photography journey, even the basics can seem a bit daunting. So our next slider, exposure. This is one of the most important concepts in photography. And all exposure is referring to is how bright is your image. This is an overexposed image. This is an underexposed image. Hopefully in your camera you've captured the correct exposure, but here you can see with this zeroed out, this photo's pretty dark. So this slider allows you to control your exposure after you've taken the photo. So in this image, I'll brighten this up to 0.5. And in photography terms, if you're wondering, that is known as half a stop. If I bring this up to 1, that is like brightening our photo up by 1 stop. But while you're just getting started, you don't necessarily need to know any of that. All you need to know is, does my photo look too bright or too dark? And just move the slider back and forth until you get to that sweet spot where you think, yeah, that looks about right to me. The smart contrast slider that we're going to look at now, really useful. Most of the time when you're photo editing, you will want to add a little bit more contrast to your raw photos. The next slider, smart contrast, is really useful. And for this photo, it's going to be invaluable. Let's grab it and start moving that to the right. All of a sudden, our washed out and very flat image has a nice bit of contrast to it. If your photo is really contrasty to begin with, you can get the slider and move it into negative territory. But that's obviously not what I want to do for this image, so I'm going to move our slider off to the right. Now, rather than going all the way to 100%, what I'm going to do is just leave that kind of halfway so that we can make further refinements with our highlight shadows, our whites and blacks. This video is brought to you by Squarespace. No, it's not. It's brought to you by me. Now, I make all these videos and share this content with you for free, and I love doing it. But if you want to help me out and you don't have Luminar AI yet, I've got a link below with a discount code. So you get to save some money, and I also get a very small commission from that as well. And that just helps me out keep creating this free content. So if you like the look of Luminar, hopefully this is a win-win for everybody. So the concept with the highlights and shadow sliders is basically the recovery of information. Let's suppose that you had an overexposed photo like this and everything was getting what's known as blown out. How do you recover those highlights? Well, that's what this slider is all about. You bring the slider to the left and all of a sudden it brings back some of that detail in the highlights. And the same is true for the shadows as well. If you grab the shadow slider and boost that to the right, you're brightening up the shadows. So effectively you're either darkening or brightening the highlights, and the same for the shadows, brightening or darkening the shadows. So these sliders give you a lot of control over your image. Now I've put things back to where it was and I'm thinking that the exposure is just a little dark, so I am going to boost that up. And that's a good example of how sometimes it's a bit of a back and forth, how you make a change in one place and then you think, okay, now I need to drop my highlights. Oh, perhaps I need to boost the shadows now. And you can kind of dance between the different sliders until you get things finessed and locked in where you want them. Right, onto the blacks and whites. When we expand the blacks and white slider, these are actually really important. More often than not, you'll want to make sure you have a pure white point and a pure black point in your photo. Let's have a look. So as I say, this might normally be collapsed down so you won't see it. So just open this up. And while this isn't a hard and fast rule, this is a good guideline. Usually you'll want a pure black point in your photo and you'll probably want a pure white point as well. I'm fortunate because I'm using a very high-end monitor, so it's really easy to see what my pure white and pure black points are. But if you're not using a monitor that represents the tones particularly accurately, particularly at the very bright and dark points of your image, the best thing to do is come to the Luminar AI logo, come to View, and you want to turn on your histogram. So at the bottom here, we have Show Histogram. And when I click that, we get access to this little graph here. This may well be familiar to you, but if it's not, let me just quickly explain. Basically, this is a distribution of the tones through our image. On the left-hand side, this represents black. On the right-hand side, this represents white, with 50% grey being in the middle. The higher the graph goes, the more of that tone we have in the image. So we have a big peak here, which is somewhere from the middle of the graph through to about 70%. That is telling us that we have a lot of pixels that are all sat around this tone. And that is our sky here. The rest of the distribution here, that is representing the pixels in the rest of the photo. So how does that help us? Well, it tells us that because nothing is appearing over on this right-hand side of the histogram, we don't have a pure white point. And because nothing's over on the left-hand side, we also don't have a pure black point. So what I'm going to do is grab the whites and I'm going to start sneaking this up to the right. All of a sudden, you'll see that our image got brighter, and when I let go, the histogram was redrawn and all of this graph had stretched out to the right. If I grab the blacks and bring those down and let go, all of a sudden you see that the graph has been redrawn and that's now stretched out to the left. And in terms of the image itself, by adding these changes, you will have seen that we introduced more contrast. And of course, that makes sense. Rather than keeping our tonal range confined to those middle greys, we're stretching out that information so that our shadows are getting darker and our highlights are getting brighter. So obviously that's introducing more contrast into our photo. So in the graph, you can see that we're still not quite at a white point. And for this photo, that might be okay because we might not want the hazy sky to be going to pure white. But let's suppose we did. We'd grab the slider and push that up to the right. To make sure we're not bleaching out those highlights, we can again do the little dance, come back to the highlight slider and bring that down. Come back to the whites, bring those up. So for a lot of photos, this is the approach you'll take because the brightest part of your photo shouldn't be a muddy, washed out grey. It should be a pure white. And that's what this slider allows you to do. By the same token, you can bring the darkest point of your photo down to a pure black. But that's not necessarily the case every time, and in this one I don't want my sky going to pure white, so I'm just going to bring this back down just a little bit. What I'd like to do is just quickly show you a before and after of this photo. So by coming up to the eye tool and clicking that, we can see our before and see our after. So if we look at this original, it's got a very blue tone. If I show you the after, you can see that we've neutralized the color balance. Again, I'll switch to our original and you can see that we've got a very flat photo, not much contrast, and it's a little lackluster. When I let go, you can see the effect that just this one panel has had already. And we haven't even dived into the curves yet. I am a big fan of Luminar's before and after toggle feature. You've also got the slider here as well. And if we do look at our comparative before and after, while we have neutralized the white balance, I actually prefer the cooler look of the original. So I'm just going to grab the temperature slider and just ease that back down ever so slightly. Let's have a look at our before and our after. It's probably less inviting than the image we had before, but I feel it's more representative of the scene when I took this photo. So that's what I'm going to go with for now. And let's dive into our curves. In my opinion, we've saved the best till last. Curves are phenomenally powerful. They've been in photo editing software right since the very beginning, and there's a very good reason that they're still around today. The developers at Luminar AI have done their very best to hide this tool from us, but within the light panel and the drop-down box, we have access to curves, and from there we have an exceptional level of control of how our image looks. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on curves in this particular video, but if you'd like to know more, write curves in the comments below, and if there is enough interest, I'll put together a video specifically about how to use curves. Curves can do so much for us in our photo edit. It can add or reduce contrast, we can boost the midtones, make creative looks, and we can even color tone our image through the curves tool. As a quick demonstration, just by clicking on the line and moving the point up or down, we can control the brightness value in the image. By bringing the shadow section down and the whites up, we can add contrast. I can bring the highlights down just to protect those highlights if that's what I want to do. And let's suppose by adding the smart contrast and making these other changes, we felt that the image was starting to lose that hazy atmosphere that we had in the original. Well, one thing we can do is actually grab the bottom left control point and just start to bring that up ever so slightly. And that's just going to lift our black point up for us. And you might think, well, why are you doing that? Because we dropped the blacks down to have a pure black point and now you're getting rid of it. I like to embrace the fact that photo editing is a creative process, and I love the fact that we can layer one effect on top of another. And by lifting the black point, we can still keep our contrast, but if you watch as I bring this up, we can kind of create more of a muted vintage look. But rather than being at pure black, I just want to lift this just a little bit. And as the very last thing, although Luminar has some insanely cool tools for adding some creative color grading to your photos, let me quickly show you how we can do that inside of the Curves tool. The red, green and blue dots here represent the different color channels that work together to actually create your photo. Yep, every single pixel that goes into making up any photo is comprised of just those three elements, red, green and blue. So let's jump into one of those channels. Let's go for the blue channel here. And if I grab the center point here, you can see that we can introduce some blue into the midtones, we can take it away. And by taking the blue away, conversely, we're actually adding in what in digital terms is the opposite color. And in this case, that's yellow. If you ever want to get rid of any point that you've made on a curve and you don't like it, just simply double click that point and it's gone. But rather than just adding a point and adding or taking away the blue, what we can do is actually talk straight into the highlights. So by grabbing the top right slider and moving that over, we can introduce some blue into just the highlights. We can take blue away from the highlights and that's going to create a more warm yellowy look in those highlights, and we can balance it out by bringing in some blue into those shadows. And I've done that just by lifting up this far left point which represents the shadows in the photo. So if I take it all the way to the top, you can see just how extreme that is. We're adding blue into the dark part of the image, but we don't want to be that extreme. So I'm just going to bring that back down. But just like that, by lifting the bottom left point and dropping down the top right point, we've been able to create a blue-yellow harmony. So let me close down the light panel, and you can see denoted by this little dot next to it, this is the only panel inside of Luminar that we've used to edit this photo. So we've taken it from this and turned it into this just with one single panel. As I said at the beginning, most of the editing features built into Lightroom are built around these sliders here. So the fact that we have a fully functional raw editor just in this single panel here before we've even looked at any of Luminar's other AI tools, I just think is insane. Now, if you're watching this video, you've already got Luminar AI surely, but if you haven't and you like the look of it, we can help each other out because I've got a link below with a discount code that's going to save you some money, and I also get a small commission from Skylum for that, and that just helps me keep creating this free content for you guys, freely sharing these training videos with you. That's it guys, I've done my best to explain all of the options and sliders inside of the light panel. If you've learned something or enjoyed this video, do me a favor, give me a thumbs up, really helps me out. And if you've got any questions, leave them in the comments below. I always do my best to get back to everybody. And if you've enjoyed this and want to see more, you can subscribe by clicking on my logo, and also appearing to me to the left and right, you've got some other videos that may be of interest to you. So I'd love to have you along to watch those ones as well. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers guys, see you later.